Hi, my name is Katie Williams. I'm the Technical Manager for Dengie Horse Feeds, and welcome to our training on equine gastric ulcer syndrome. Are we feeding the problem? So I'm going to take you through the different types of ulcers that we now know exist, their incidence levels, and then also look at the dietary strategies we can implement to try and reduce the risk of them happening. So bear with me while I minimize myself and move me out of the way. So you can see the slides. Okay, so here we go. First of all, how big a problem is equine gastric ulcer syndrome, or EGUS? Press the right buttons. The first studies that were done really looked at racehorses and found an incidence level of between 75 and 90%. And this is probably going back 20 years or so now. Since then, subsequent studies have looked at other disciplines, including eventing, show horses, endurance. And I think it's fair to say that the endurance one was quite a surprise, which is why I've highlighted it here really, in that the level was so high, up to 93%, depending on the study. And the reason it was a surprise is that the contributing factors that we knew sort of resulted in ulcers in racehorses were things like a low fibre diet and working at speeds, race intensities, which obviously the endurance horse doesn't do. So it was a little bit confusing as to why that level at 93% came through. And we'll explain a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. But it certainly started to change our thinking and not just assume that this was a problem associated with fast work and low fibre rations. And equally in the leisure sector, so leisure horses and donkeys can have an incidence of around 40%. And again, this goes to show that it isn't just a disease associated with racehorses anymore. I think it's fair to say that we are diagnosing ulcers more frequently. More vets have long enough endoscopes to be able to see into the horse's stomach. And so it's not just a case that the modern horse is more prone to ulcers, it's just that we're better at diagnosing them. And you can see here some of the common sites for gastric ulcers. So the two in that squamous epithelium are right on the border or the junction between the two different types of tissue that feature in the horse's stomach. And then we have one area in the bottom half, as we see it there, the glandular region. And EGGD is the new name for sort of glandular ulcers, so equine glandular gastric disease. But we also tend to call them pyloric ulcers. And as you can see, it's really because they're in the pyloric region most commonly. So EGGD can happen anywhere in the glandular region, but it tends to be most common in that pyloric region. Going back to the squamous epithelium, those two sites, it is a question of geography, basically. It's on that border, and the different types of tissue, so the glandular epithelium has its own built-in mechanisms to protect the stomach against the acid, but the squamous epithelium doesn't. So the glandular region is where the acid is produced, so is generally more acidic, and as that acidity level creeps up through the stomach, if there isn't something present to stop it rising up, it will come into contact more frequently with the squamous epithelium, and that's what tends to result in ulceration. So it is a question of geography. So as I mentioned, we have two distinct diseases. ESGD, equine squamous gastric disease, occurs in that squamous region and is typically linked to acid splashing up into the area that has no built-in protection. So that squamous tissue has nothing in it, in its own structure, to protect it against acidity. It is relying on a physical barrier of food present in the stomach, so generally fibre, and also the presence of saliva to buffer the acidity there. So as the horse chews, he produces saliva that contains bicarbonate, and that helps to neutralize acidity in the stomach. When we don't give him enough to chew, so too little fibre, we have that double effect. So there's not the physical presence of fibre there to stop the acid creeping up and coming into contact with the squamous epithelium, but also he won't have spent so much time chewing, so he's probably got a more acidic content in his stomach as well. Now, more recently, we've diagnosed a second disease, which is EGGD, so equine glandular gastric disease, And this tends to occur as a result of a breakdown of the protection systems in that glandular region of the stomach. And I've put due to stress question mark in brackets because we don't fully understand this disease process yet. The research is only really gaining momentum in the last few years. We do have some consensus statements now from vets as to the best practices and the sort of data sort of contributing to our knowledge about this issue or this disease, but it's only really in the last few years that that's starting to come together. So we're still learning about how to manage it. And we'll cover some more of that as we go through. So why does the squamous gastric disease occur? Well, we've talked about high speed or intense exercise being one contributing factor. And I've put, again, at speed in brackets, because I think actually now it's just the animal moving, not necessarily at what we would consider to be high speed, that is actually pushing the acidic stomach contents up into the squamous region of the stomach. And if the empty stomach is the key thing, if there isn't much fibre in the stomach to act as a barrier, I don't think very much movement or very much speed is required to actually make that, push those stomach contents up into the squamous region. So speed is probably a question mark these days, just any general sort of movement, hence why we're seeing it in some leisure horses as well. Now, some of the research that has been done has shown that ulcers can actually appear only after 8 days of training, so not very long at all, just over a week. And an Australian study actually showed that the risk increased by about 1.7 times for every week of training. Horses on a high-speed treadmill have actually shown increased abdominal pressure and decreased stomach volume compared to when they're at rest, which simply means when they are moving at speed that the stomach is compressed, and therefore, it's not a great surprise that everything in the glandular region is being pushed up into the squamous region. The level of acidity actually increases as well. So at the beginning of walk exercise, it continued to increase through trotting and galloping, and then they saw a subsequent decrease once walking occurred again. And those changes were less marked when horses had been fed prior to exercise. So it does go to show this feeding before exercise is so crucial for so many reasons. Now, we've talked about low fibre diets. Now, fibre requires more chewing than concentrate. So that's the key reason for feeding the fibre, is that it's actually generating the production of saliva that helps to neutralise and counters that sort of continuous acid production that the horse has in its stomach. And looking at racing in particular, racehorses may receive less than the recommended 1% of body weight of forage per day. Now, we would consider 1% an absolute minimum, and most leisure horses would be easily 1.5% of their own body weight or more. And it's only in extreme sort of dieting cases would we go as low as probably 1.25 or 1%. But it's quite common in racing for them not to receive anywhere near 1%, although things have improved dramatically over the last 10 years, to be fair. However, we do get the sort of response from trainers, my horse won't eat much fibre. And that's simply because the appetite space is often taken up by large feeding rates of cereal-based feed. So the horse's capacity to eat is finite, believe it or not, in some cases, but particularly with a fit racehorse, their appetite will often be considerably diminished compared to, say, a greedy fat pony. And you can see here, I just took this as an example of Racehorse Cube. This information's on their website. I haven't named the company, but it's fairly common and fairly typical. And you look at the sort of feeding rates for a 500 to 600 kilo horse, and you're talking anywhere between 5 and 9 kilos for a horse in heavy work. That's a huge amount of feed when you consider a flat racehorse may only weigh 450 to 500 kilos. That's easily more than 1% of their own body weight, and that's the compound feed, the sort of starchy based cereal based feeds. So it doesn't leave a lot of room to try and achieve at least 1% of body weight as forage, and ideally we would want more. So this can be one of the challenges, getting trainers to feed less of the cereal based feeds, because their perception is that that is what will make the horse run fast and perform to its best. But actually, if we take some of the more modern feeds, they are starting to come in more concentrated forms, so you feed less, which actually then means the horse has got some room to fit in some forage as well. So it's going in the right direction, but if you come across traditional trainers feeding these high levels of cereal-based feeds, it's certainly a good thing to try and change them away from that if you can. So saliva production, there are two contributing elements to the amount of saliva the horse produces. We have one factor is the amount of chews of food. So if we're comparing, say, forage with concentrates, the forage actually achieves or requires more chewing, and a horse as a result produces around 400 to 480 grams of saliva per 100 grams of dry matter consumed. So quite a lot of saliva, especially when you compare that to concentrates, and by that we're meaning cereal-based feeds, your racehorse cubes, mixes, that kind of thing. The amount of saliva produced there is significantly lower at around 206 grams of saliva per 100 grams dry matter. So about, well, half basically, maybe less than half in some cases. So that's a huge difference. And we know that saliva is important because of its buffering effect. And in that saliva, you've got things like potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate, and they're the elements or the minerals, if you like, that actually help to buffer the acidity. And then we have the amount of food to chew. So we have the type of food and the amount of chewing that particular type takes. And then we have the amount of food that we're actually providing, which has an impact on saliva production. Because yeah, sure, forage takes more chewing and therefore should produce more saliva. But if you don't feed very much of it, it's not going to have the desired effect. So a small number of meals per day and periods longer than 6 hours without food access actually increase the likelihood of gastric ulceration. So again, if we can feed at least 1.5% of body weight, it's going to have a hugely beneficial effect on trying to reduce the risk of ulcers. Timing of feeding, can you implement little and often with your forage feeding? And again, we're all about trying to overcome some of the objections of our clients and customers who find lots of reasons not to do what we advise them to do. Some are very genuine and others less so. But what we want to do with horses on restricted rations, and this can be at either end of the spectrum, so it would apply to customers with fat cobs or overweight horses and ponies where they're having to ration the amount of forage they give, and also it might be at the other end of the scale for fit elite performance animals where their owner or trainer, rider, etc. don't want to feed high levels of forage. So what we need to do is try and reduce the risk of time their horses without it. So implementing little and often with forage, just as you would with any bucket feed, becomes important. Obviously, what is fed to the horse actually matters as well. One study showed that feeding 1% of body weight as grain resulted in a marked increase in ulcers in non-exercised horses. So again, these are quite exaggerated sort of levels of feed, but it certainly showed an impact. And the poor old racehorse, as we saw, is quite typically fed these kind of levels of cereal-based feed. So again, another risk factor for them. But 3.7 to 5.1 kilos of grain, and to just try and put that into some context, because sometimes it's hard to visualize what these weights actually mean. 3.7 kilos is around about 3 scoops of mix per day. It's around 1.25, maybe 1.5 kilos of mix or cubes in a large stub scoop. So again, quite a few horses, particularly if they're poor doers or they're being fed up to put weight on and condition on, then they would certainly fall within that sort of feeding rate. And the study shows that 2 grams per kilo body weight of starch per day, or more than that, obviously doubled the risk of ulcers, and 1 gram per kilo body weight of starch per meal was 2.5 times or 2.6 times more likely to give the horse ulcers. So they're both risk factors, the total amount of starch per day as well as the total amount of starch per meal. You could say that the meal amount is the worst. So in other words, if you trickle it through the day as much as you can in lots of small meals, it's going to be potentially less risky than 2 really big starch-based meals. And I should point out at this stage that we have a starch calculator on our website. So if you or your customers would like to calculate how much starch a feed is contributing, then you just need to know the level of starch in the feed that you're using, which you can find on a lot of companies' websites, as well as the actual weight of feed that you're giving. And then it works all of these calculations out for you, and it will tell you whether you're under the level or over the level, and therefore at risk or increased risk of ulcers. So that's well worth checking out on the Dengie website if you can. So there were some issues with other forages. Another factor associated with gastric ulcer lesions was a high amount of straw in the diet, and it's really important to comprehend that this was basically a solely straw ration. So straw per se as a part of a mixed ration is not a problem. It was when it was used as the sole forage source, then there was an increased risk of gastric ulcers, and it was a project or a study carried out in Scandinavia, and it is quite common there to use straw as the sole forage source. It is not common to do that in the UK, so it is very unlikely that this would ever be an issue, to be perfectly honest. But of course, people look on the internet, see straw is bad or increase the risk of ulcers, but don't look at the context. So if you have a customer that comes in and says, well, I can't feed straw to my horse, he's got ulcers, then you might want to just talk them through the fact that the study that was done was when it was used on its own with no other forage at all. And as part of a ration, particularly if the horse is overweight, the benefit of fibre without too many calories is going to far outweigh any ulcer risk. And what's so good about alfalfa for gut health? Well, it gives you more chew time than cereals, but pretty much the same energy level, depending on which product you're using. As an example, from the Dengie range, AMTRA Original would give you as much energy as a cool mix or a high fibre cube, but on average with around 10 times less starch. If you want to go high calorie or high energy, then things like AMTRA oil and to some extent the AMTRA molasses free, when you look at the per scoop feeding rate, they are very high calorie, so around 11 to 12 megajoules per kilo, which is comparable to competition mixes, conditioning mixes. The difference being that they're very low in starch, again, compared to traditional mixes and cubes, around 10 times less starch, but you're still getting that energy that will fuel work, and it's slow release energy, so it's not going to fizz them up or make them overexcitable. It's very sympathetic to the digestive system, and it has the benefit of taking longer to consume, which, you know, the horse is a herbivore. It's designed to spend 16 to 18 hours of every day eating. And when we put these very concentrated cereal-based feeds in without forage, then we're completely turning their normal eating behavior on its head or upside down. So it's the wrong way around. Whereas if you're using forages like alfalfa, which is a really high quality forage, you can provide lots of nutrition, lots of energy, but without the levels of starch that are really, you know, associated with a number of diseases, not just ulcers, things like colic and laminitis as well. And the study, I think it's back in the 90s now, showed, and again, it was an independent study, it wasn't funded by Dengie, so it was work done at Texas A&M University in the USA, and it showed that alfalfa was a natural buffer to acidity. So over and above a grass hay that they used to compare, so it wasn't just the fact it was forage and the chew time and all those other benefits, there was something about alfalfa that actually had a benefit over and above the grass hay that was fed as well. So the severity of ulcers was lower in the horses, and the incidence was lower. So there was only 1 of the 12 had ulcers, whereas on the hay, 9 of the 12 had ulcers. So that's a really significant difference. And just to prove the point, the researchers then took the alfalfa out of the ration, and they found that there was a significant worsening of the ulcer severity when the alfalfa was removed. So that's a pretty conclusive study, and I think it's fair to say that most researchers and vets, and to be fair, other feed companies will typically recommend alfalfa in the situation where a horse has gastric ulcers, because it has this natural buffering effect. And if you look at any one sort of ulcer product, whether it's in a chopped fibre format or a cube or a mix, they nearly always have some alfalfa in there, and it's really to take advantage of this particular benefit of it as a plant. And what is so special about alfalfa? Well, it's because it contains high levels of protein and calcium, both of which buffer gastric acid. And also the cell wall contents are thought to have some buffering capacity as well. So things like lignin, which actually gives the plant structure and helps it to stand tall, acts as a buffer in the digestive tract as well. And interestingly, I did a little bit of research earlier this year actually. I was trying to get to the bottom why alfalfa as a plant has such a low starch level, because it's obviously photosynthesizing and making sugar just like any other plant does. But what does it do with that sugar? It doesn't store it as fructan, which grasses do. And interestingly, it actually converts it to starch and then moves the starch into its roots. So it's storing the starch below ground, which is obviously a bit we don't take when we make the horse feed. And it's why the bit that grows above ground is very low in starch and therefore perfect for feeding to horses, because the starch is safely tucked away in the parts that we don't want. So I mentioned the starch calculator on our website, and again, it just goes to show how numbers can be a little bit misleading at times. So alfalfa, the bits above ground, only contain 2% starch, so that's the declaration for all of the pure alpha A range. And per kilo, that means that alfalfa would provide just 20 grams of starch. And a kilo of alpha A, for example, is about 2.5 sort of round bowl-shaped scoops. Now, a 500 kilo horse would actually be allowed to have 1,000 grams per day. So in theory, and this is purely theoretically, as far as starch is concerned, and it just demonstrates how safe something like alpha A actually is, you could feed 50 kilos, so what's that, 2.5 bags of alpha A, and still only just get to the level of starch that's recommended for a horse per day. So it couldn't be much safer than that. Now, obviously, there's lots of other reasons why we wouldn't recommend feeding 50 kilos of alpha A a day, but from a starch perspective, that's the sort of quantity you could feed and still be safe. So I thought I'd share with you a little survey we did with horse owners a couple of years ago now, so in August 2018, and we got a pretty good response rate, 267 people, sourced via the Horse and Hound social media and email database as well. And these findings, we were just trying to get to the bottom of how much horse owners actually understood about ulcer risk and some of the actions they were or weren't taking. And I think this is where an opportunity really lies with retailers and those of you that get to talk to horse owners regularly. If they ask you about how to manage or how to feed a horse with ulcers, because there is still a lot of scope to improve what people are actually doing out there. So 67% of horse owners, as a result of understanding an ulcer risk, had actually increased access to hay and fibre. But again, a third hadn't done that. Now, it could be, to be fair, that they already fed ad lib fibre, but I suspect it's either they don't have the access to it or availability, or perceive they can't afford to do it. There could be other reasons, but I mean, that would be, quite frankly, a no-brainer to make sure that a horse prone to ulcers had ad lib access to hay and fibre. 62% were avoiding starch and cereals, and as I put there, 38% weren't. So that's, again, over a third of people. Again, a no-brainer. Take the starch and the cereal feed out. Really get to the bottom of whether it's a perceived need to be feeding cereals and starch to their horse or an actual need. I would put a lot of money on the fact it's probably a perceived need rather than a real one. Hopefully, as I've demonstrated with anybody's alpha A type product, you can feel most horses in light to moderate work, and you can add oils and other things that aren't going to increase the risk of ulcers if you need to fuel harder work. 57% had increased turnout, and I do have a little bit of sympathy for those that can't or couldn't or hadn't, because sometimes that is well beyond your control. If you're on a livery yard and their policy is that you can't turn out longer or at certain times of the year, then that one can be tricky to implement. But another one that we could improve on is the 56% were feeding a double handful of chopped fibre or alfalfa shortly before riding. The empty stomach is such a key risk factor. So just a double handful of fibre about 20 to 25 minutes before exercise could have a huge effect or reduction in the risk. And we could probably reduce ulcers by just getting more horse owners to do that before they tack up. So some opportunities there to improve things. So in simple terms, and some really good sort of simple advice for any customer or any horse owner really, but certainly in terms of trying to reduce the risk of gastric ulcers, we should be encouraging everyone to turn out with other horses if that causes them less stress. There are a few genuine cases of agoraphobic horses. I have come across that where, particularly in rescue cases, they haven't been allowed out for the first 10 years of their life, then suddenly trying to turn them out when you've rehomed them might not be the most appropriate thing to do. So yeah, try and turn out as long as that doesn't cause them too much stress. Feed at least 1.5% of body weight as fibrous material per day. Implement the small frequent meals of forage throughout the day if you can, particularly important for those that are good doers where you might be on restricted rations. Why not use some multiple forage types to increase consumption times? I think this is particularly important, or a great way to put added sales through your business. If you can say, well, why don't you take a bag of chopped grass, something like our pure grass, alongside your Alpha A, which might go in the bucket feed, give them a big tub trug of the chopped grass, put some apples and carrots in there to encourage them to forage them around. It's really good enrichment for their behaviour and sort of welfare and well-being when they're stabled for longer periods. So, and it certainly makes the horse owner feel they're doing something really constructive and extra for their horse. Try to use forages with good calcium and protein content, so that would be typically alfalfa. Things like sugar beet could also be quite useful here because that is also a great source of calcium as well. And just remember that a proportion of straw is okay, particularly if you have a good doer. And I'm a big advocate of using straw up to around 30, maybe even up to 50%, depending on the horse's body weight and condition. If that's a way to provide fibre but facilitate weight loss, because you're not putting too many extra calories in, then that is definitely the way forward. And avoid grains. Do you really need to use them? Really challenge that point, because there's a lot of misconception out there. But if you have to use them in inverted commas, then remember the maximum 2 grams starch per kilo body weight per day and the 1 gram starch per kilo body weight per meal. So what can we use if we do need some extra energy? So if you're trying to promote weight gain or improve stamina and performance in, say, an endurance athlete, then oil is definitely preferable to starch. Now, when we consider the different energy values of oils, they're pretty much the same. Okay, they're all going to be around 35, maybe 38 megajoules per kilo of digestible energy. It's the other sort of structural components, if you like, of the oil that are the important factor. So typically we talk about things like omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And at one end of the spectrum, the best sort of omega-3 sources would be things like linseed, which is high in omega-3, but they tend to be less stable. So that good level of omega-3 actually makes them more vulnerable to going rancid. So they're not always the most practical oil to use, particularly if you're exporting to hot countries or shipping around the world, or if you have a long shelf life on your product. So that is something to bear in mind. And then the omega-6 tends to be higher in things like soya. Rapeseed oil is sort of in the middle. So a sort of selection of those oils will usually be the right sort of balance to use. Now, there are some other attributes given to different oils. And one of the research papers that has been done looking at the use of oil in the context of gastric ulcers, well, in fact, there were several papers and they showed both the fact that the oil does have an effect and that it doesn't have an effect. So very inconclusive. But I think sometimes when papers are viewed in isolation rather than looking at them in totality, you can find evidence to use things like corn and maize oil. The thing I would say about that was that the research paper was focused very much on the glandular disease issue. In fact, in the context of the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories such as bute. So, I think we've pretty much proven that that really is a very low risk issue these days for the horse. But the rationale from the researchers for using it was because of its linoleic content. And as a nutritionist, I would argue that other oils have more linoleic content than the corn and the maize oil. So even that doesn't stack up for me. So personally, I don't believe the type of oil really is going to make that much of a difference. I'm using it, if I am putting it into a rash hem for a horse with ulcers, really as a source of energy that's not going to increase the risk of ulceration, not as some sort of therapeutic agent, quite frankly. So I thought I'd take us through some case scenarios. So I've got here the good doer with ulcers. We've sort of covered some of these principles really as we've gone through, but just to reiterate and reaffirm the sort of recommendations we would make. So little and often forage is really important. If you can split the total daily ration, which is ideally a minimum of 1.5% of their body weight, if you can split that into 4, maybe 5 offerings throughout the day, so much the better. I know that's not always going to be possible for every horse owner, but encourage them to work with people on their yards. If you go down early, maybe you could put a hay net in for someone else, and if they're there later, they could put one in for you. So working together will help to improve horse welfare for sure. Consider a mix of straw and hay together, so you're getting more fibre for less calories. And remember, it was one study that just used straw. Is the only evidence that we have of straw causing a problem with ulcers. When it's mixed in, and particularly if for some reason somebody can only use haylage, then it becomes even more important to try and dilute it with some straw. Minimum 1.5% body weight as forage per day. Maybe in extreme cases, you'd go as low as 1.25 if you've got a really good doer, but try and aim for that 1.5%. And then all you need to add alongside is a balancer or a supplement appropriate for the level of work the horse is doing. So if it's a leisure animal, just an everyday broad spectrum vitamin and mineral supplement or a balancer, so we have leisure vitamins or leisure balancer, they would be perfect for this sort of scenario. At the other end of the spectrum, if we have a poor doer with ulcers, then we're looking to utilise a forage that's soft and leafy, ideally. We want it to be digestible because we want this animal to get as much out of the forage as possible, so we can reduce our reliance on the bucket feed. And we tend to talk about a wrapped hay these days, so it's this sort of forage that's dried almost to the point of becoming a hay, and then it's wrapped. It tends to be harvested earlier than a traditional unwrapped sort of hay, so it happens to be a little bit softer and a bit more digestible, but because it's so dry, it actually hasn't fermented, so it's not acidic. When we analyse these forages, they contain just as much sugar as hay, and by sugar we're talking simple sugars at around about 10%, so that doesn't include all the storage sugars as well, but that would be typically things like fructan, which might be as high as 17 to 20%, but in simple sugar terms, it's around 10% because it hasn't been fermented. If that was a proper haylage or silage and it had been fermented, that sugar level should be lower than what you would find in hay because it's the sugar fermentation that preserves the forage. Feed it ad lib and obviously turn out if the horse is happy there. And you're trying to use a high calorie feed. So in this case, Alpha A oil is high calorie, but with 10 times less starch than the equivalent cereal conditioning mix. We would then use alpha beaten or sugar beet, an unmolassed product, to give you a great source of highly digestible fibre that would be conditioning. And again, with very low levels of sugar and starch. Interestingly, sugar beet can cause a bit of confusion because of its name, but the sugar has actually been extracted for use in the human food industry. What we're left with is the pulp or the residue, so it's very fibrous material, and in an unmolassed sugar beet it would actually be less than 5% sugar because that extraction process for the human food industry is pretty efficient. And because it's grown underground, sugar beet is a root crop, a root vegetable. It doesn't need the structural fibre to hold it upright like some of the forages grown above ground. And that means it's very digestible because it hasn't got those indigestible components giving it the structure and the strength to stand up tall. A 500 kilo horse would need around 2.5 kilos per day, which is approximately 5 to 6 scoops if you're using Alpha oil or equivalent, and that gives you lots of chew time. You'd then use a balancer or supplement alongside. Again, if it's a working horse or something that's maybe older, select a balancer or a supplement that reflects their status or workload. And then you could use a digestive enhancer, so things like yeast or prebiotics. And we're trying to help the horse get the most out of the fibre and the forage that we're giving them. So these products effectively do that. They try to make the gut healthy so that the population of bugs can do their job at breaking down fibre as efficiently as possible. And we come across increasingly actually horses with dentition issues that also have gastric ulcers, because if they've been struggling to chew for a while, and certainly long enough to result in weight loss, and then the owner notices something's wrong, then it can be long enough for an ulcer to form as well. And they're not always old, so it can be linked to diastema, which are the gaps or abnormal gaps between teeth that can become packed with food and create abscesses and basically cause the teeth to rot and fall out if they're not caught soon enough. And as a result of not being able to chew properly and perhaps experiencing discomfort when they're eating, they start to reduce the amount of fibre they consume. So in these scenarios, we would tend to use things that are very soft and easy to chew. So I recently launched pure grass, or an equivalent, which is just chopped grass. Would be great. If they can't even manage a short chopped fibre, then the next step is to use something like a soaked grass pellet or alfalfa pellet, maybe with some amylase sugar beet as well if the animal needs some condition. The thing I would say for alfalfa is that it is going to provide you buffering even in a pelleted form, okay, and the grass won't, and that's because of the difference, as we said earlier, in its content of things like calcium. So there is a rationale for using some alfalfa pellets alongside the grass pellets. And you would feed these on a weight for weight basis. So in other words, if you were feeding 10 kilos of hay, for example, you would feed 10 kilos of chopped fibre or pelleted fibre, and obviously before that you soak it to make it into a mash. So there's no getting away from the fact it is quite an expensive way to feed, but these straight sort of grass pellets are usually the most cost-effective options. You could also put something like a high fibre cube in as well, just to help sort of make a bit more variety and potentially dilute some of the other ingredients if you needed to. I thought I'd just give you this case study. This was a horse affectionately known as Pooh, a stable name, and she was a horse that was diagnosed with diastemas. And it's really to make the point that just because you can't eat long length forage, it isn't sort of a case of, well, you can't then perform and look good or look well. She had lost a lot of weight when her owner Alicia contacted us, and it was diagnosed to be linked to diastemas. She had also got gastric ulcers, so they were obviously treated and medicated, and then her ration going forward was a combination of grass pellets, the Dengie alpha beet, and a performance plus balancer. So very little starch because of the ulcer risk, and a fibre diet that was very easy for her to chew and eat, so basically a soaked mash of fibre. And she actually completed a 3-star 3-day event in Ireland at the Tattersalls event just on that ration. So it isn't a barrier to being able to perform, and I think look amazing, to be honest. So I just want to touch a little bit on the EGGD. So most of the content we've had so far has been focused on the ESGD, so the squamous gastric disease. With the glandular gastric disease, all of the previous advice would apply because it's just good management anyway. So we would recommend all of those things: reduce starch, increase forage, feeding before exercise, etc. But the other things, or the other sort of extra factors to consider for a case of EGGD, is that because of the link to stress, it's actually recommended to provide a minimum of 2 rest days from work per week, or regular rest periods. And I think some trainers feel that that would be too much because they can't get, as they would call it, the work into them to get them fit enough. So it might be better to do 6 to 8 weeks and give them a 2 or 3 week break or something that allows them to recover and time away from the stressful environment. But certainly for show jumpers and other sports where probably it's fair to say you could give a horse 2 rest days a week quite easily and not compromise their fitness or their ability to be able to do their job. it would actually be very beneficial to do so. There is a study to show that 2 rest days as opposed to 1 actually did help to reduce the risk of EGGD. Again, turning out where possible, provided the horse doesn't become stressed by turnout, and reducing stress is absolutely key for this disease in particular. The consensus statement I mentioned from a group of vets really sort of pushed home the message to try and minimise management changes and other potential stresses, things like changing their equine companions and their human carers. They like the continuity, assuming that they get on with their companion or their carer in the first place. I suppose the key is to find the right one and stick with them. And although at the moment there is no direct link to diet as such, they are still recommending this feeding of chopped fibre about 20 to 30 minutes before exercise. So again, just good basic risk reduction management for ulcers. I also want to just touch on the beta mark. So we have to be very particular about how we say this. So it's suitable for equines prone to gastric ulcers as part of a balanced diet. It should not be referred to as the beta ulcer mark, for very sort of specific reason that this is an approval system that shows a feed is not going to increase the risk of gastric ulcers. In other words, it won't treat, prevent, or cure ulcers, but it's suitable for horses and ponies that might be at risk. The scheme does not allow claims relating to ulcers, right? It actually contravenes all the medicines and medication licensing and advertising rules and regulations if a feed implies that it's going to treat, cure, or prevent a disease, and for that matter, any disease. So to suggest otherwise is actually illegal. What we're talking about is a feed that is suitable for and should not increase the risk. So we're trying to maintain gut health, and we're trying to avoid claiming any medicinal sort of claims for particular ingredients. So we can say that alfalfa is a natural buffer, but we can't say alfalfa cures ulcers or treats ulcers. And there is a definite difference. I hope that's sort of clear. And I just wanted to sort of round up with an ulcer story, if you like. And this was actually told to me by a trainer, and it's about the horse Silver Birch, who went on to win the Grand National in 2007 with a trainer called Gordon Elliott. Prior to that, he'd started his racing career in a different yard. And again, bearing in mind this is going back at least 15 years, probably 20 years when he started his career in the original yard, he would come into work and do all his fitness work, but after about 6 weeks, he'd actually get about halfway up the gallop and literally stop, refuse to move. And going back that long, I think it's fair to say we didn't have the knowledge that we have today. So the vets were doing lots of checks, and they did actually find a little irregularity with his heart. So something like we would call a heart murmur. So that particular trainer effectively gave up on him because they couldn't get him past 6 weeks of training. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the horse ended up with the trainer Gordon Elliott. And when the original trainer asked him how they got over the heart issue and went on to win the Grand National in 2007, Gordon actually revealed that it wasn't the heart at all. It was the fact that 6 weeks into training, he would get ulcers, and they were so painful, or he was so sensitive to them, that he would actually get halfway up the gallops and have to stop. And I think the trainer that, if you like, the one that got away for him, no trainer wants to miss out on the winner of a Grand National, has done everything possible since finding that out to reduce the risk of ulcers. So compared to many of his peers, he's actually feeding a relatively high fibre diet and doing the feeding before exercise, because that really was a tough lesson to learn. And it's a great illustration of all the things that we talked about at the beginning, that for every week of training, the ulcer risk goes up 1.7 times. So Silver Birch was a classic example of that. Now, obviously, we have a lot more knowledge, and probably ulcers is one of the first things that if there's a problem with the horse in training, we'd want to rule that out, straight away. So yeah, things have moved on a lot, but there's still much work to do, as you've seen from our own survey with the horse and hound users. So there's opportunities to get people doing things better even now. So I thought I'd include some of the references that I mentioned in the presentation. Again, just to conclude by saying the Dengie feed line is always available to you. If you want to email us, we have live chat on our website now. You can contact us via all the social media channels, and you can still pick up the phone and talk to us in person if you'd like to. But I hope this has been a good review of where we're at with gastric ulcers, the two different types of diseases, and some of the common scenarios that we come across. But do get in touch if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.